In the United States, Donald Trump has questioned the safety of vaccination. The Vice President Mike Pence believes God created the earth less than 10,000 years ago, and the American Enterprise Institute, or the AEI, promotes skepticism about the scientific evidence for anthropogenic climate change. My next guest, science historian Professor Naiomi Oreskes, gave the AEI a leading role in the work that she and Eric Conway wrote, Merchants of Doubt. And now, Professor Oreskes, she's a Harvard professor, has, if you like, gone back to basics and asked, should we tend to give our trust to scientists who, after all, have made mistakes? Her latest book, or collection of lectures, is Why Trust Science, which, I suggested, was based on the premise that science is facing a public crisis of trust.
Well, I wouldn't put it quite that way. I actually don't think it's a crisis of trust. All of the evidence suggests that, particularly here in the United States, but in other countries too, in general, most people still do trust science on many, if not most issues. But we do know there are some specific issues, of which climate change is the one I've been most closely involved with, in which we do have a crisis, where we have compelling scientific evidence of an extremely grave and imminent threat, and yet we're going about as if nothing is happening. And part of the reason for that is because of broad, widespread misunderstanding of the science in the United States, which has partly been generated by a deliberate attempt to create confusion about the issue.
That may be the case, but the subtitle of Merchants of Doubt was, of course, as you know, how a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming. So, you know, scientists were, if you like, the villain of that story. Why should we trust them?
Well, exactly. And so that's the whole point of this book, is to step back from the specifics of a handful of people. One of the key points of that book was that the vast majority, probably 99% of all scientists, were in agreement about climate change, as they were similarly in agreement about acid rain and the ozone hole and the harms of DDT. But a very, very tiny group of people had undue influence, in part, I'm sorry to say, because of the role of journalists who had given equal time to this tiny handful of dissenters, and also because of the role of organizations like the American Enterprise that had served as an echo chamber to advance the disinformation or the dissent of these individuals. So in that book, what we were trying to show was that these people did not, in fact, represent the consensus of scientific evidence. And in the new book, I talk about, well, what is the consensus of scientific evidence? What does it even mean to say there's a consensus? And why should we think that the consensus of evidence is likely to be a good basis for decision-making, not the views of a handful of lone wolf dissenters?
I feel compelled to leap in a tiny little jump to the defense of journalists, because you say that history shows that scientific truths are perishable. Sometimes scientific truths are perishable. So how can we tell if something is trustworthy, is long-lasting, is the truth?
Well, on some level you can't, and you just have to live with that, I'm sorry to say, and so do I. There is no magic ball, there is no equation, there's no formula that lets us apply it to say this science is right and that science is wrong. But if we take seriously the perishability of scientific knowledge, then we also have to take seriously the durability of scientific knowledge. And what we see from history is that a huge amount of science has, in fact, been incredibly durable and has been a very good basis for decision-making, both on the public sphere and also in our own personal lives. And if we had to place bets, or if we had to make decisions based on scientific knowledge versus, you know, other kinds of alternatives, cranks, dissenters, misanthropes, we would have done much better overall in most cases trusting the science. And so it's not a call for blind trust. It's not a call for blanket trust. It's not a call for suspending judgment. And in the book, I talk about some specific cases where we would say that scientists did go wrong and what we can learn as citizens and journalists from those examples. But what we find in general, broadly speaking, looking at 400 years of scientific history, is that in most of the cases where we think scientists went wrong, what we find is that actually there wasn't a consensus. So where there is real substantive debate inside the scientific community, then that is something to which we need to pay attention. So it requires us to make some distinctions about what constitutes real scientific debate versus what constitutes disinformation. And that's not always easy, although often it actually is easy. Often it only involves a small amount of homework. But we do have to do that work. And in Merchants of Doubt, we did that work. We pointed out that the people who were spreading doubt about climate change were not actually climate scientists. They didn't publish articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals. They mostly took their debate into the halls of think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute or the George Marshall Institute. And so it didn't take a lot of work to realize that this was not actually a real scientific debate. This was some kind of, politically motivated disinformation. And we can see that in many examples if we take a little bit of time to look, or if we check in with people who actually are experts. If we go back to the example of climate change, if you had asked any credible climate scientist at the time, Jim Hansen or Mike Mann or Ben Santer, are these people credible climate scientists? They would have told you, no, they're not. But very often people didn't do that homework, and so a lot of damage was done.
I want to talk about the examples in your book under the title Science Awry. But just let's look at climate change and the science for a moment. Do you think that climate change has politicized science, and that's the confusing thing?
Well, climate change hasn't politicized science. Certain people with a vested interest in disinformation have politicized science. So scientists have been trying incredibly hard to communicate the facts as they understand them. Scientists have been trying incredibly hard not to be political, bending over backwards, in my opinion, probably going too far the other way. But what they have been subject to has been a politically motivated, organized network of disinformation designed to create public confusion. And the scientific community has had a very hard time knowing how to respond to that because scientists aren't trained in rhetoric, they aren't trained in communication, they aren't trained in journalism. And so they have been really kind of stymied knowing what to do. And so the response of the scientific community is to provide more and more science, more and more facts, more and more evidence. So if you look at the IPCC reports, for example, they get longer and longer and longer. They get bigger and fatter and filled with facts. And it doesn't work because they're not up against a factual problem. They're up against a political problem. And so part of our work has been to try to identify the character of that political problem, but then also in the new work to characterize what does it really mean for something to be scientific? What does real science look like? Because if we had a better understanding of what real science looked like, I think we would be more able to identify and reject the fraudulent claims that, are promoted to create disinformation about climate change.
Let me rephrase then and revisit that question. Do you think the argument about climate change has politicized scientists? Because we now see scientists marching, campaigning,
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Joining the Extinction Rebellion movement.
Yes, I see what you mean. Well, yes, to a certain extent, I do think that the attack on climate science has politicized some scientists. So some scientists have seen the ways in which they've been attacked politically, and so their response is to say we do have to fight back politically. And I think that's a tricky position for scientists to take, but I certainly understand why they feel that way, because they've come to understand you can't fight a political claim with more factual evidence. Well, in some cases you can, but it's a very tricky thing to do. It's also the case that a lot of scientists are taking to the streets, joining Extinction Rebellion, because at the end of the day, they're people too. So just because you're a scientist doesn't mean you hang up your rights or responsibilities as a citizen. And so many of the scientists who are now becoming involved, let's say in Extinction Rebellion, they're still doing science. They're still working in their laboratories. They're still publishing peer-reviewed papers, articles, doing research. But in addition, they are also speaking up as citizens and saying, we have a crisis and we have to respond to it, and the time has come for political action. So I don't really see those two things as necessarily mutually exclusive, but I do think it is important for us to be clear about the distinction between doing scientific work and doing political work. And I think that in some cases you can do both, but they're not the same thing.
It opens scientists up, though, doesn't it, to accusations of bias and subjectivity from their opponents on the issue, for example, of climate change.
Well, it does open them up to those accusations, but I think what scientists have realized is they're accused of that anyway. I mean, for 30 years, climate scientists have been accused of being biased, even when they were bending over backwards to avoid any political involvement, any suggestions of policy, and it really didn't protect them. So their attempts to be apolitical didn't help. And so I think some scientists have said, well, we spent 30 years trying what it looked like being apolitical, and we were still attacked and accused of being subjective and biased, so maybe now we'll try something else.
I'm talking to Naiomi Oreskes about her latest book, which is Why Trust Science? Interesting examples, as we said in your section of the book, Science Awry. Tell me about the limited energy theory.
Yeah, well, that's my favorite example of a really crappy piece of science. So in the mid to late 19th century, there was a theory that was put forward by a very prominent scientist here at the Harvard Medical School who thought that women should not be educated. And he argued that this was a deduction from thermodynamics, from the law of conservation of energy, because if women worked hard in their studies and developed their gray matter, then they wouldn't have enough energy for their reproductive function, and their uteruses would shrink.
Seems reasonable.
Well, except he had no empirical evidence. It was a theory. His clinical basis was 7 patients, all of whom were self-selected because they were already suffering headaches and other things, and all of whom he judged to be either doing education or work that he deemed unsuitable. So it was, by current day standards, an incredibly unscientific claim, but it was deeply influential, mainly because of his authority as a prominent physician at the Harvard Medical School. What I point out in the book, though, was that there was no scientific consensus on this issue. In fact, there was a strong dissent that was put forward by an important female physician at the time, Mary Jacobi. And so I point this out as really evidence for 2 things we should look out for. One is we should never base an important social decision based on a single study. Dr. Clark's book was one book. One study alone is not sufficient to make an important decision on. You can compare that to climate change today, where we have literally tens of thousands of peer-reviewed scientific articles and literally hundreds of reports that have been written for governments on the issue. And the other thing is that we do have a consensus among scientific experts about climate change. We did not have a consensus among scientific experts on the limited energy theory. So that's a really nice example where you can contrast a body of scientific knowledge that is robust with a body, well, not even a body, a single scientific claim that was not based on a robust body of evidence.
A couple or 3 of your examples seem to suggest that science was hampered by the kind of male culture of science and medicine at the time. Another one is hormonal birth control and depression. The link between it was discounted despite a lot of women saying this is the case. The male establishment said, nah, you're wrong.
Exactly. And so this is an important part of my argument for what I would call tempered trust in science or informed trust in science. I am by no means advocating blind trust in science. And I think one of the lessons of history is that a really important thing to look at is the diversity of the community involved. If the community doing work is not diverse, if it's all men or it could be all women, except we don't have any case of that in the history of science, but all white men or all middle-aged white men, then there's a good chance there'll be blind spots, particularly when it comes to issues of gender. And we see this in the case of the limited energy theory. A male scientist proposes a theory that in retrospect is clearly preposterous and clearly not based on adequate empirical data. And it was a woman physician who pointed out these limitations. And similarly with the case of hormonal birth control, a substantial amount of evidence from patients, from female patients, that taking hormonal birth control was affecting their moods, causing depression in some cases, even in some rare cases, suicidal level depression. And not all doctors dismissed the evidence. Some doctors, particularly some psychiatrists, took it seriously, so that's to their credit. But quite a few of male doctors, particularly male gynecologists, were dismissive of this evidence. And so I draw two lessons from that. One is the one you just said. We need diverse scientific communities to make sure that our scientific communities don't have blind spots when it comes to race, gender, or other issues. And we also have to be open to the idea that evidence comes in a variety of forms. And even though patient reports might not be the perfect form of evidence, because obviously patients are subjective, no doubt about that, but just because a person is subjective doesn't mean that what they're saying is false. It simply means it has to be weighed against other forms of evidence. And so this is an argument for a kind of capacious or Catholic view of evidence to recognize that evidence comes in many different sizes, shapes, and colors. And when you're looking at something tricky like emotional conditions or nutrition is another important example, we have to be open to a diversity of evidence, even if in some cases that evidence comes in forms that are a little bit less than optimal.
Well, that was discounted because it was self-reported, and that's not very scientific. But you do make the point that the male hormonal contraceptive injection was shown to work just as well as the pill, and the clinical trial was stopped because of adverse effects, one of which was an increase in mood disorder, self-reported.
Correct. So there's the tell in that case. When men self-report, it's perfectly fine. When women self-report, not so fine. So obviously, that's a kind of textbook example of gender bias.
One of your areas of specialty is plate tectonics, and you use that as an example of science awry. Talk to me about that.
Plate tectonics is a very nice example because it doesn't involve gender or racial bias. So it's nice to have some examples that, don't fall into things that are sort of obviously problematic. In the case of plate tectonics, what we see there is that it's often claimed that scientists roundly rejected the evidence of moving continents in the 1920s when the idea was first proposed. But actually, that's not quite true. What is true is that American scientists in the United States and to some extent in Canada, so North American scientists, rejected the theory with very few exceptions. But in Europe, there was a big debate in the United States as well. But in Europe and in Australia, New Zealand, parts of South Africa, there were quite a few scientists who took the theory seriously, some who even advocated for it, and many scientists who reserved judgment. So it simply was not the case that there was a consensus against the theory. It was more like there was a consensus that we did not yet have enough evidence to say for sure one way or the other. And that's a very important distinction, particularly if we're looking at a contested public policy debate. Because to say that something is wrong or false is very different than to say we don't yet have enough evidence to say. In the second case, we need to do more research. Now, this is another important distinction because one thing we know about climate change deniers and the advocates of eating too much red meat and eating too much sugar and other things like that, they will often use the argument that we need more evidence as an excuse for delay. And we saw this very extensively in discussions of climate change back in the 2000s. So if someone says we need more evidence, then again, we need to look closely at that. If there is not a consensus in the scientific community, then that is telling us that, yes, indeed, we need to do more work. However, if there is a consensus, but somebody from the fossil fuel industry is saying we need more work, well, that's a different matter.
I should ask you, given your expertise in the area of climate change, earlier in the programme we heard from Jonathan Safran Foer, who's written a book called We Are the Weather, which is an argument about really reducing or even giving up eating meat, essentially, in order to save the climate. What's your view of that?
Well, I think this is a really important issue, and I'm glad that there's a much bigger conversation starting to take place about it. We know that about 60% of greenhouse gas emissions come from burning fossil fuels, and the other 40% come from agriculture and land use change, which includes deforestation in order to make way for more beef cattle and other forms of agriculture associated with beef eating and cattle dairy. So the 40% of greenhouse gases associated with land use changes in agriculture is very substantial, not quite half, but nearly. So it is extremely important that that's part of the conversation. And when it comes to eating meat, one reason that it's very important is the whole issue of climate change is frankly depressing. I mean, I'm constantly being asked for good news about climate change. And eventually I'm getting to the point where I want to throw the microphone across the room because this is not a good news story. This is a seriously bad news story. And we have to take that on board if we're actually going to act with the alacrity that is required. However, the one small good news in this story is that one thing we can do ourselves that does not depend upon anyone else, and we can start tonight at dinner or breakfast, I don't know what time it is in New Zealand right now, is to greatly reduce, if not altogether eliminate, our red meat consumption. Because we know that beef cattle are a very substantive contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And the win-win of this is that we know that it's not actually very good for our health to be eating a lot of red meat. Now, most listeners I know probably don't want to give up red meat entirely. I don't actually want to give up red meat entirely, but we can greatly reduce our red meat consumption, and it's better for dealing with climate change, and it's better for our health. And the health evidence is extremely strong. And interestingly, just in the last few weeks, we've seen this big move in the United States by the beef industry to try to tell us that it's totally fine to eat red meat and processed meats. And I'm pretty confident that this is not a coincidence, that as people are focusing on red meat as something that's very important in relation to climate change and that we really do have agency over and that we really can control in our own lives, the beef industry is fighting back, trying to tell us that it's really good for our health to eat red meat, and that's just not true.
I suspect that our own industry's argument would go something like this. If we don't produce meat here in New Zealand, then somebody else will produce it, and it will be a great deal worse for the environment than the way we do it. How does that argument run with you?
Yeah, that runs like junior high school. I mean, that's like my children saying, Mom, but if I don't do it, the other children will, right? I mean, that's one of the most, juvenile arguments that any person could make. So it's just a silly thing because so much of meat production is driven by consumer demand. And if consumers demand other things, the industry will respond. And I don't believe if we all reduce the amount of meat we eat, then manufacturers will change what they produce. Now, look, don't get me wrong. I love lamb. Lamb is my favorite meat, and I don't want to eliminate lamb from my diet entirely. However, we can eat much less. And I should say, since I'm talking to folks in New Zealand, lamb is a whole lot better than beef. So if you're thinking about trying to adjust what you eat, the first thing you want to get rid of is beef and dairy cattle. The second thing would be lamb and pork, and then poultry and eggs kind of next. So you can greatly reduce your contribution to agricultural greenhouse gas emissions simply by eliminating beef and dairy cattle.
You might have to add a new chapter to Merchants of Doubt if your beef industry keeps arguing the toss.
Yes, I know. Well, this is the depressing thing about my work. There's always new chapters, sadly. One time an agent asked me if I was planning to talk about, I don't know, this, that, or the other thing. And I said, do you want a book or do you want an encyclopedia? So, we struggled to keep that book focused on a particular set of issues that the protagonists we were studying had worked on. But yes, absolutely. We see similar patterns in many other industries as well. And it's very upsetting and disturbing. But we hope that people who have read Merchants of Doubt will see the pattern. They won't need us to say, look, the meat industry is doing the same thing now. They will recognize it themselves.
I'm talking to science historian Professor Naiomi Oreskes. I don't want to get too solipsistic, but there is a piece of the book that applies most pertinently to New Zealand because we have very fierce sun here and we are constantly exhorted to slop, slip, slap, or slap, slip, slop, put on the sunscreen. And you've got a very interesting piece about sunscreen, which goes to the question that you pose, why trust science? Tell me about what happened.
Well, this is another interesting example of the problem of single studies or studies that are not peer-reviewed. So right around the time that I was finishing the book, an article was published in Outside magazine, which is a magazine that celebrates outdoor activities, exercise. It's a magazine I like, a magazine I read, and in general, it's a magazine that I enjoy. But they published an article that I considered to be quite irresponsible, profiling a scientist who was claiming that we should not use sunscreen because being exposed to the sun is good for our health. Now, this is
which is a great story, right? I mean,
correct.
You
exactly.
would be very hard put to find a journalist who would turn that story down.
Correct. And so this is a dilemma for journalism. And I understand that it seems like a good story, and it might even be a good story if it were true. But again, dig a little deeper. What do we find? Well, it was one scientist who was being profiled. He had published 2 articles, both with extremely small sample sizes. If I recall correctly, one was about a dozen people and the other was, I don't know, maybe it was 18 or something, very tiny samples. And in fact, the effect that he was claiming did not actually even occur in one of the 2 articles that was being cited. And the author himself said in the paper, well, actually, this doesn't support the hypothesis, but we need to do more work. And then they claimed that he had another bigger study, but that bigger study hasn't been published yet. So it hasn't been peer-reviewed. We don't know what the quality of the work is. It may never be published if the methodology is no good. So based on unpublished work and 2 very tiny, small sample studies, Outside Magazine ran a big article claiming that we could just forget about sunscreen.
The headline said, "Is sunscreen the new margarine?"
Correct. So this is very irresponsible journalism because many of us would prefer not to wear sunscreen. I would prefer not to wear sunscreen. It's expensive and often smells bad and it's a bother. But it was quite irresponsible because we know that excessive sun exposure, especially for people of European descent living in Australia and New Zealand, it's very clearly linked to skin cancer, including deadly melanomas. So this is very irresponsible reporting. But it gets back to, I don't want to beat up on Outside Magazine. Well, I kind of do because I'm mad at them because I like them and they should know better. But mainly what I want people to know is one study is not enough, or 2 small studies. You need a body of data. And if you have a large body of data telling you that excessive exposure to UV light causes cancer, you don't want to just throw that away because of the latest study that just happened to come out this week. And I know that that's hard for journalists because it's not that exciting to say, well, here's a new study that might be right, but we don't really know and we're going to have to wait at least a few more years before we figure it out. That's hard. So there's kind of a gap or a dilemma between the way journalists operate and what makes for a good story journalistically versus what makes for scientific truth.
And this is always going to be the case, right?
Well, I don't know if it's always going to be the case. I mean, historians are all about change over time. I think journalists could examine some of their practices and, it is possible to imagine rewriting that article with a different headline, less inflammatory headline, that says, look, there is some evidence here and, we can take this on board and we can say, for example, here's something that I would say to my own children, use the lowest level of sunscreen that will protect you, right? Because, getting some sun, getting vitamin D, we do need vitamin D in our lives. And we all know that being out in the sun feels good. So I don't think that we want to tell people they should just stay indoors all the time. Or if you could also, do the Australian thing, slap on a hat, right? I think you mentioned that a minute ago. You can wear a hat, you can wear long sleeves. There are alternatives to sunscreen, lotions, and potions. But by and large, the evidence still supports the idea that for the vast majority of us, including people, dark-skinned people, wearing sunscreen when we're exposed to the sun, particularly midday sun, is the right thing to do to avoid skin cancer.
I wonder if the dermatologist Richard Weller, upon whose findings the article was based, was he mortified?
Well, I don't know. That would be an interesting follow-up article.
Mm. And as you say, he may one day be proven right. But
correct,
at present,
exactly.
The alleged benefits of sunlight on blood pressure, which is his point, are not even close to proven.
Correct, exactly. And that would have been a good conclusion to the article.
It's a very difficult thing. I mean, we've got a cartoon here, and it's got 2 pages. And the first page says, a whole bunch of very authoritative scientists are claiming this. And in the interest of bias, we are now going to interview a complete idiot.
Right, exactly.
And
right.
That's an exaggeration, but it's pretty much what journalists feel compelled to do in many ways. And the dissenter makes for a better story.
Well, so I'm inviting journalists to rethink that and to think through, is there a way to write interesting and compelling stories without promoting some complete idiot?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe that's the title of your next book.
Or maybe your next book.
Yeah. You talk about Pascal's wager, just getting back to climate change. Talk to me about Pascal's wager, because that's quite a compelling thought.
Well, Pascal's wager is essentially what today we would call the problem of type 1 and type 2 errors. And it relates to what you said a moment ago, which I think you got exactly right. It's quite possible that at some point in the future we may discover that the scientist who believes that sun exposure reduces blood pressure and therefore will reduce heart attacks, we may find out that that's true. And if so, then that'll be great. But in the meanwhile, until it's proven, until we know, it makes sense to stick with what we definitely know, which is that excessive sun exposure causes skin cancer. And so Pascal's wager relates to that. He's really asking us two things. What do we know for sure? And in the areas where we don't know for sure, what are the relative risks of either accepting as true something that's false or rejecting as false something that's actually true? And so his famous example was the greatest existential question of them all: is there a God? And Pascal concluded that since there's no way to ever know for sure, we should think about the relative risk of believing in God or not believing. And he says, well, if I don't believe in God and God exists, I'm going to burn in hell, so I better believe in God. And so we can use that framework to evaluate all kinds of things. And climate change is, again, the one closest to my heart. There is a possibility, I think it's extremely remote, but we have to acknowledge there's some possibility that tens of thousands of scientists have got the wrong end of the stick on climate change. But so many of the things we need to do to fix climate change would make for a better world any case. So much of the pollution, like particulate pollution that's associated with burning fossil fuels, is terrible for our health. And sitting in traffic jams is no fun, and that's bad for our health too. So many of the changes that we need to make would be good anyway. And so the cartoon that I use in my book is the one where a scientist has given a big lecture about all the things we can do to fix climate change, and someone in the audience says, well, what if it's a big hoax? And then we create a better world for nothing.
Yeah. The format of the book, you write, other commentators, qualified commentators respond or critique, and then you respond, is kind of the scientific method in itself, is it not?
Well, that's right. And so the book came out of a series of lectures I gave at Princeton University in which we had commentators. But then we had the idea that it would actually be really good to include the comments plus my response to them in the book because, as you say, we would in effect be demonstrating the scientific method. We would be practicing what we preached because we would show the way in which science works by critical examination, reconsideration, and using the criticism of colleagues to improve and strengthen our knowledge.
What's Karl Popper's notion of falsifiability? In one part of the book, you talk about the history of science and that how was the scientific method arrived at and what does it mean? And Karl Popper, of course, spent time in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. Falsifiability, the goal of science is to disprove theories. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, well, it's a little sad about Karl Popper because he was a very brilliant person and he's been very, very influential. But the basic notion of falsifiability is pretty much hogwash. And there's a huge amount of literature on this. And it's a sort of peculiar thing to understand why that idea has had so much traction when we know it isn't really correct. So I guess the short version of it is to say Popper was trying really hard to solve a true and important problem, which is the problem of testability, or as he would have called it, the problem of confirmation. One of the things that philosophers before Popper had established is that if you test a theory according to the standard hypothetico-deductive model, have a theory, you have a hypothesis, you do a test of it somehow, if the theory passes the test, it does not prove the theory is correct. And we have lots of arguments to show why this is the case. So Popper was trying to solve that problem. He said, well, what about the opposite? If it fails the test, then does that prove my theory false? And he concluded that the answer to that question was yes, that proof was asymmetric, that you could never prove a theory true, but you could prove a theory false. And so he built his whole philosophy of science on that. He was a very famous person. He was a very articulate person, and very persuasive. And so he persuaded many people of the validity of this approach. But actually, it doesn't work either. There are many examples that we can give where a theory that doesn't pass a test. Turns out actually it is true. It could be, for example, that there's something wrong with your instruments, or that the sensitivity of the test was simply not sensitive enough to detect the effect. So it turns out that his asymmetrical hypothesis or asymmetry hypothesis isn't really true. Either way, you can have problems, whether you're trying to prove a theory true or prove it false. They both run into all kinds of difficulties. And so this is one of the reasons why I argue that there isn't really one method of science, that there are methods, and falsifiability can be understood as one possible method. If you can show that a theory fails strong tests, then that is a really important thing to point out. And then the advocates of that theory will have to either figure out why the test failed, or they will have to eventually abandon the theory. So falsifiability is useful, but it's not the sine qua non that Karl Popper thought that it was.
Are you happy with the way science is operating now? I mean, we hear a lot about, the negative results being missed out and only the positive results reported, and I suppose that goes to an increasing distrust about science. Do you think that it could be improved?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm not entirely happy with the state of current science. I think anyone who's close to the scientific community knows that there are serious problems, particularly in some areas, like some areas of biomedicine where the pressure to publish quickly, I think, does lead to people publishing sloppy results. So I think we can definitely identify areas where scientists need to do a better job of cleaning up their own household. And I think it's really important that scientists do that, because if we are going to maintain public trust, then we have to make every effort to make sure that we do keep our house in order. But that said, one of the things I talk about in the book is that if you look closely at contemporary science, you come to the conclusion, or at least I personally have come to the conclusion, that some of the claims about problems in contemporary science are really overblown. So probably the most familiar, many people know that there's been claims that there's a replication crisis in science or a retraction crisis. But if you actually look at the retraction rate, it's incredibly tiny. And the retraction rate is not necessarily the same as the error rate, but if we think of it as being at least a rough approximation for the error rate, it's incredibly minuscule. It's something like 0.02%. So, I mean, what human activity has an error rate that low? I'm sure journalists make more mistakes than that. I'm sure I've made more mistakes than that in my footnotes in long books. We know that anything that people do will be subject to error. So the real issue is not, do people make mistakes? The real issue is, are they open to correcting their mistakes when they're found? And is there a mechanism, is there a system for correcting the mistakes? And this is what I want to argue is really the strength of science. So something that people have argued as a problem, retractions, is actually, no, it's actually evidence of a good thing, that scientists actually have a mechanism for identifying errors and correcting them. Now, I'm not saying that mechanism always works perfectly. Clearly, it doesn't. But it does exist, and I do think it's much better than other fields like, I just think about sports. Referee makes a bad call. Oh, well, tough luck. We've seen games lost and won over bad referee calls. So, and of course, sometimes there are people in sports saying that sports should have better mechanisms for correcting bad calls. But science probably has one of the most robust mechanisms for correcting error of any human activity. And that's what I like to focus on, the idea that scientists have a mechanism for learning from their mistakes. And frankly, that's something that all of us could learn from.
And that was Naiomi Oreskes, who's written a book called Why Trust Science, and details of her presence in New Zealand on our web page.